My dear children, today's topics are reinforcement and punishment. And one of the important concepts of Skinner's operant conditioning or instrumental conditioning is reinforcement. Now children, you have to know about what is reinforcement. Reinforcement, any event or stimuli that when following a response increases the probability that the response will occur again. Yes. So, reinforcer is any kind of stimuli or event which increases the probability of the occurrence of a desired response, occurrence of a positive response, and strengthen and repeated our behavior. Suppose children, and if you will get above 95% or 90%, your teacher or parents will provide any kinds of positive stimuli. Yes, and will give any reward. Maybe it's materialistic reward or any kinds of the verbal rewards. Yes, so these kinds of stimuli will enhance your desired behavior. Yes, and increases your desired or positive behavior. So that is called, reinforcement. Any kinds of stimulus or event, which increases the probability of occurrence of a response, repeated and strengthen your behavior. Yes, so this is reinforcement. And now the types of reinforcement. Yes, and reinforcers can also differ in the way they are used. That is important. And now the types of reinforcement is positive and negative. Some kind of pleasurable consequence, yes, that means like a reward, will lead to an increase in the likelihood of that response being repeated. Yes, so what is positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement? And both positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, are important for our behavior modification and increases our behavior. Yes. Now, what is positive reinforcement? Now, children, the reinforcement of a response by the addition or experiencing of a pleasurable stimulus involves stimuli that have pleasant consequences. Yes, strengthen and maintain the responses that have caused them to occur. Whatever I said just a few minutes ago, again the same, your behavior, you will get the good marks, any kinds of desired response. Yes, your teacher, your parents, your friends, any kinds of family member, will give a positive stimuli and provide any kinds of positive stimuli. It's pleasurable stimuli. This is called, the positive reinforcement. Yes. Now, children, what is negative reinforcement? Why use the term negative? Yes, you have to clear. Why use the term negative? Both kind of reinforcement are important for our behavior changes and behavior modification and increases our behavior. Yes. So now, negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is the reinforcement of a response by the removal and escape from or avoidance of an unpleasant stimulus. Yes. And children, any kinds of behavior. The behavior results in avoiding an unpleasant stimulus. Yes. And suppose your lying behavior, an unpleasant stimulus, scolding. The likelihood that the person will have that way again, that means lie in the future, is increased. Just as positive reinforcement will increase the behaviors, and the important thing is that the term negative, and people get confused because negative, this sounds like it ought to be something bad. Yes, like a kind of punishment. But there is a difference between negative reinforcement and punishment. And negative reinforcement involves unpleasant and painful stimuli. Yes. And negative reinforcement leads to learning of avoidance and escape responses. And the problem is that, children, the name sounds like, the negative. It should be some kind of punishment, yes. But why we use the term negative? You want to avoid negative stimulus. You want to avoid painful stimulus. That's why I use the term negative. That's why I use the term negative. Yes, want to avoid painful stimulus from situation. That's why I use the term negative. Yes. And now, punishment. Punishment always decreases the likelihood of a behavior. Yes. Punishment decreases our responses. But the reinforcement, no matter whether it is positive or negative, strengthens responses. Yes, the negative reinforcement, we use the term negative because want to avoid or escape any kinds of negative stimulus from situation. Suppose, for example, and one learns to put on woolen clothes. Yes. And use electric heaters to avoid the unpleasant cold weather. Yes. And one learns to move away from dangerous stimuli because they provide negative reinforcement. Yes, children. So, negative, the term we use, we want to avoid negative stimulus from situation. Yes. And now, what is primary reinforcer? Primary reinforcer is biologically important since it determines the organism's survival. Yes, like food. And secondary reinforcers is one which has acquired characteristics of the reinforcer because of the organism's experience with the environment. Frequently use money, grades as reinforcers. They are called secondary. Yes, not essential for our life. That's why we use the term secondary. Yes. And primary is essential for our survival. And now, and in operant conditioning, reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement is one of the important concepts. And positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. And there is a difference between negative reinforcement and punishment. Yes. And use of punishment reduces or suppresses the response. And a negative reinforcer, increases the probability of avoidance or escape response. Yes, example, example of negative reinforcement like stopping at a red light to avoid getting in an accident. Yes. And other example of negative reinforcement, mailing an income tax return by April 15 to avoid paying a penalty. An example of punishment by removal, having to lose some of your money to pay the penalty for late tax filing. Yes. So, there is a difference between negative reinforcement and punishment. Both reinforcement, the negative reinforcement and punishment, again I repeat, enhances our behavior. Yes, and punishment reduces our desired behavior. And important thing is that, children, the punishment is the opposite of reinforcement. Yes. And as many parents know, punishing a child's bad behavior doesn't always eliminate the behavior completely. Yes. But as time goes on, the punishment is forgotten and the bad behavior may occur again in a kind of spontaneous recovery. Yes. We psychologists always recommend, and provide negative reinforcement. Yes. And now the punishment. How to make punishment more effective? Punishment should immediately follow the behavior it is meant to punish. Punishment should be consistent. Yes. And now, number of reinforcement and other features. It refers to the number of trials on which an organism has been reinforced or rewarded. Yes. Amount of reinforcement. That is also important. Quality of reinforcement on the basis of age, on the basis of event. Yes. Provide proper reinforcement. That is important. Amount of reinforcement, quality of reinforcement, all are important. Now the schedules of reinforcement. Yes, schedules of reinforcement. And reinforcement refers to the arrangement of reinforcement delivery during the course of conditioning trials. Yes. And continuous reinforcement and intermittent on partial reinforcement. And now, continuous reinforcement. When a desired response is reinforced every time it occurs, we call it continuous reinforcement. Yes. And in your exam, in every exams like term 1, term 2 and any other exam, and after your desired response and get 95% above, 90% above, and your teacher or parents will provide a proper reinforcement after every exam. Yes. So, a desired response is reinforced every time it occurs. We call it continuous reinforcement. But intermittent and partial means there is a time gap between your response and that means your desired behavior and reward or reinforcement. And intermittent schedules responses are sometimes reinforced and sometimes not. It is known as partial reinforcement. Yes. And the example of partial or intermittent reinforcement, salary. Yes. So, in this kind of reinforcement is not delivered for each desired response trial. Yes. And we know there are various types of partial reinforcement. Yes. Fixed ratio, variable ratio, and the interval schedule also, the fixed interval, variable interval, etc. Okay, so the reinforcement is effective for behavior modification, is one of the important technique for behavior therapy. Yes, we use reinforcement, various kinds of aspect of our life and some disorders also, and behavior modification also. Reinforcement is important technique for behavior therapy and behavior modification. Thank you, my dear children.